This is the finals. I'm going to say one thing. I'm very proud of both of you. Rami, you are going to be on the pro. Angelou, you are going to be on the con. I congratulate you. I'm going to disappear, and I'm going to let the 5 judges take over right now. Boca, you're in charge.
Thank you, Ron. And let's start with the first presenter, which is Abhirami on the pro side. Abhirami, as you know, you will get 4 minutes to present your opening speech, and 4 minutes will start as soon as you're ready.
Okay, judges ready? Opponent ready? Okay, my time starts now. What would happen to our world if we let rogue nations do anything they wanted? They could harm anyone, anywhere, at any time. Our world would be filled with fear. Economic sanctions is the answer to this. Unfortunately, not many people advocate for sanctions, and that is why I'm here to talk about their benefits. Economic sanctions are a safe, destruction-free means of achieving what is right. What more could you want? This leads me to my points. Nuclear proliferation by rogue nations is dangerous. These days, we don't just worry about chemical weapons. We have biological and nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons cause mass destruction that destroys generations to come. Just a few weeks ago, we received a threat from North Korea threatening to bring us down to our knees. And this just proves how immediate the active threat of nuclear proliferation by rogue nations is. Thankfully, economic sanctions deters the development of nuclear weapons. How does this work? Well, rational leaders are sensitive to the effects of sanctions, and they consider the risk of economic sanctions before considering a nuclear weapons program. For example, economic sanctions in Iran deterred the nuclear development there. If not for sanctions, so many other countries would already have nuclear weapons already. So this argument is supported by an article on the success of non-proliferation sanctions on www.cambridge.org. Also, without the threat of sanctions, we would be living in a world of many nuclear-armed states, as predicted by President John F. Kennedy. As mentioned in Brookings.edu, today there are only 9 countries with nuclear weapons, the same number as 25 years ago. This speaks to the success of nuclear proliferation sanctions. So, economic sanctions stop the violation of human rights. Human rights violations are not a single country issue. They're an international problem. Everybody needs to have the same basic set of human rights. And if that is not being given to everyone, economic sanctions are a direct and tangible way of standing up for the human rights. For example, apartheid. People were being discriminated against just because of the color of their skin. Yes, there were activists, but economic sanctions caused disinvestment. Disinvestment means people pulled out their investments from that country. And moral people did not want to invest and directly or indirectly benefit the apartheid government. So sanctions gave the momentum needed to move from the apartheid government to the democratic government. Finally, what other options do we really have available if not for sanctions? I'm sure that even my opponent agrees that war is not an option. Negotiations and diplomacy do not always work. Even to get the other country to consider negotiations, we need economic sanctions. So, Judge, I urge you to vote in favor of economic sanctions. I now stand for cross-examination. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhirami. Andrew, it's your turn to start cross-examination, and you will get 2 minutes for that.
Okay, so Abhirami, you talked about how, in your first point, you talked about how nuclear proliferation in rogue nations, that was your point, right? What do you mean by rogue nations?
Rogue nations are basically countries that threaten the peace of the world. That's like the exact definition that I saw online.
Okay, thank you. Also, So nuclear proliferation is naturally bad. Was that what you're saying?
No, I said that nuclear weapons cause mass destruction for generations to come. So nuclear weapons in the hand of rogue nations would be really, really dangerous.
Yeah, okay. And do you think it's likely that countries would use nuclear weapons anytime in the future?
So if a country develops nuclear weapons, they're probably going to use it. And if not, then why develop the nuclear weapons anyways?
Okay, and also, you used the example of South Africa for your human rights contention. Did you have any other examples?
So there's China, where free trade was being restricted. So sanctions imposed on China not only showed betterment in their practices, but also influenced the behavior of other countries around the world.
Okay, and also you talked for the very end. You talked about what are the other options? Was that a full-fledged was that one of your points, or was that just something that you left in there?
No, that was one of my points, that we really don't have any. Well, this is sanctions are the perfect option because they're the middle between like complete war and just talking it out.
Okay, and so you didn't. So do you have any evidence for that point, or was that just this?
Well, it's sort of just logic because because we don't just jump to sanctions. We first do try like negotiations and diplomacy and try to warn the country first, and then we do have sanctions. But if
Thank you very much. That would be time. So it's Andrew's turn to present opening speech.
Yeah.
Andrew,
Okay.
you have 4 minutes.
Yeah, I don't have a timer, so could you like do a hand signal
No
when
worries.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so my time
Welcome.
begins now. In Iraq, women and children starved to death and died of preventable diseases because of economic sanctions. Economic sanctions will and continue to cause these horrendous effects, and that is why I do not agree with the resolution that economic sanctions as a foreign policy tool do more good than harm. This is because economic sanctions can cause a humanitarian crisis and because economic sanctions help the leaders. My first contention is that economic sanctions do not do more good than harm because economic sanctions can cause a humanitarian crisis. This is because economic sanctions cause a lack of food, medicine, and resources that leads to an overall lower health and well-being in a country or community. For example, before economic sanctions, Iraq had a highly praised education system that was praised around the world. However, after economic sanctions, a combination of low resources and poverty-stricken families created extremely low percentages of enrollment. For example, according to the WHO, enrollment and attendance rates dropped to alarmingly low levels, with 50% of girls not being able to get an education in some areas of the country. All these girls had dreams to fulfill, to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a politician. They had the potential to change lives. However, these dreams were crushed by economic sanctions. Another example where economic sanctions caused a humanitarian crisis also occurred in Iraq, where food shortages and malnutrition were caused by the sanctions. During economic sanctions, hundreds of thousands of people could not access or afford the low amount of food, and the crippled Iraqi government could only supply 1,000 calories a day. According to UNICEF, 500,000 children died as a direct result of the economic sanctions. The impact of the economic sanctions can lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children and lead to millions of young girls to not be able to access a proper education. My second claim is that economic sanctions do not do more good than harm because economic sanctions can strengthen the power of the leaders. Leaders can use negative effects of economic sanctions to turn their people against the sanctioning country. And in addition, the leaders of a sanctioned country can consolidate power through the manipulation of the limited resources caused by an economic sanction. One example of where this happened occurred in Cuba, where Fidel Castro was able to consolidate power thanks to economic sanctions. According to Human Rights Watch, Castro used the sanctions from the US as, quote, a pretext to repress legitimate efforts to reform Cuba from within, dismissing them as US-driven and funded initiatives. This shows how leaders can label this shows that leaders can use economic sanctions as an excuse to label reform groups as members of the enemy. As a result, leaders can use economic sanctions to actually strengthen their power. And the impact of this is that economic sanctions do not do more good than harm because they can help strengthen the leaders. And this is significant because economic sanctions are helping leaders such as the Castro family continue to violate human rights, such as the right to free speech and the right to freedom from torture in countries such as Cuba to this very day. All in all, I disagree with the statement that economic sanctions as a foreign policy tool do more good than harm, because economic sanctions can cause a humanitarian crisis and because economic sanctions help the leaders. For these reasons, I encourage a con ballot. Thank you. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Thank you very much. Abirami, your turn to do cross-examination.
Okay, so my time starts now. So how is the poverty and deaths, or no, so you said the government could only provide, like you said that the government could only provide so much, right? So isn't it a fault of the government that they could only provide that many resources for their people?
No, it's just that the government can only provide 1,000 calories a day. Let me put this in context. Like a normal adult needs 2,000 calories a day. So that means that the rations provided by the government were half of the amount that people usually need to live. And the government, it wasn't that the government.
Okay. So this isn't my question. My question is, isn't it the government's responsibility to look after its people? And if the people aren't getting like enough food or like enough resources to survive, isn't it the government's fault?
Well, the government did provide them, but the government just didn't have enough resources because of economic sanctions. They just didn't have enough. That's why.
Okay, so do you just suggest we do nothing? Do you suggest we do nothing then? Because you're talking about all the things that economic sanctions do, but there's really no other better working alternative. So do you just suggest we do nothing?
No, I do not suggest that we be complicit, but I do suggest using diplomatic measures such as using the UN or using embassies that do not cause hundreds of thousands of deaths compared to economic.
Do you really think that we haven't tried using diplomacy and negotiations? Do you really think we haven't tried?
Well, we have tried, but it's still better to continue using those efforts when conflict.
If we have tried and we still don't use them, isn't it proof that they're not effective or as effective as sanctions?
You may answer, Andrew, but shortly. Yeah.
Well, diplomacy has worked in many areas. It's just that in some cases it doesn't work. But after that, we can use other ways.
Thank you very much. So it's time for Abirami to present her refutation speech. Would you like to use some prep time?
Yes, can I have a minute of prep time?
Yes, of course. Your minute starts now. Abirami, that's time.
So, my opponent stated that sanctions cause suffering and consolidate power. But, and I would like to address the point that he made on suffering and the humanitarian crisis first. How is it the fault of the sanctions if the government that the sanction is probably trying to change is unfit or incapable to handle the sanctions? If the government is truly interested in the welfare of its people, it should cooperate with the sanctions. The sanctions are for the greater good of the country, and the government should be able to see that. And this sort of ties in with my point about the options that we have. I asked if we should just stand there doing nothing, and if we do stand there doing nothing, we would have to live with the guilt later on that we could have done something, but we didn't. Anyways, my opponent responded that we should try diplomacy. But then when I asked that if he really thought that we hadn't done it before, he said that yes, we have. So if we have tried it before, Judge, then why don't we keep using it if it worked? Why? Because it hasn't worked. He says there are many examples of when diplomacy did work, but if they did, then why don't we use them? Why? Because we need economic sanctions. They're the best way we have. And my opponent also stated that sanctions consolidate power. And this again ties in with the fact that ties in with the fact that we can't do nothing, Judge. We have to at least make an effort. There are many instances where sanctions have worked, like South Africa, even China, Iran, Taiwan, South Korea. There are instances where sanctions have worked. So, Judge, I urge you to. I strongly believe that you should vote for Khan because I was successfully able to refute all my opponent's contentions. Thank you.
Connor Pro. Thank you, Abirami. So it's time for Andrew to provide his refutation speech. Andrew, would you like to use some prep time?
Yeah, 1 minute. Thank you.
Starting now, welcome. Thank you very much. That's time. So 3 minutes.
Okay, my time begins now. So once again, my name is Andrew Liu, and I'm debating for why I disagree with the resolution that economic sanctions cause more good than harm. First of all, I'll be refuting my opponent's first contention about nuclear proliferation. She's talked about how economic sanctions do more good than harm because they can prevent nuclear proliferation. However, nuclear weapons have only been used twice in history, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that just shows how it's actually extremely unlikely that countries will use nuclear weapons once they get them. In addition, once countries get nuclear weapons, it'll actually not be that bad because it'll actually help stabilize places, because if countries get nuclear weapons, they won't use them because of the concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction. If they use nuclear weapons, they'll know that they'll be destroyed too. And according to the Council on Foreign Relations, if countries such as Iran get nuclear weapons, it would actually make a more durable balance of power. Because if, like, say, Iran gets nuclear weapons, we know Israel has nuclear weapons, and that'll just discourage those two countries from fighting amongst each other. And that's saving lives, because wars cause thousands of deaths, and economic sanctions are doing like harm, such as like killing people, but they're trying to prevent nuclear proliferation, but nuclear proliferation could actually save lives. In addition, my opponent's second contention about human rights, I'll refute that by bringing up my second argument in my debate about how economic sanctions help the leaders. In my opening speech, I talked about how Castro actually benefited from economic sanctions, and there's other examples too. North Korea uses propaganda to convince their people that America and other countries are bad, and as a result, the people get to believe the leaders of North Korea. And in addition, Castro was able to consolidate power. In all of these examples, Cuba and North Korea, those two countries still both have horrible human rights records. These people can't say what they want to say. They can't fight against the wrong things in their country because of the failure of economic sanctions. In addition, in my opponent's third argument about what else could we do other than economic sanctions, I talked about diplomacy in my cross-examination, and then she stated that diplomacy doesn't work. However, there are many examples where diplomacy has worked. For example, recently Brexit has left the European Union. That was a disagreement between many different countries about what to do. However, they were able to figure it out through diplomacy, and that just shows how economic sanctions are a bad way. Economic sanctions kill hundreds of thousands of people. However, diplomacy is able to fix this by killing 0 people while also solving huge problems such as Brexit. For these reasons, I encourage a Khan ballot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time for your closing speech, Abirami. Would you like to use the rest of your prep time?
Yep, I'd like
1
to use
minute.
the rest of my. Yep.
Yeah, 1 minute starts now.
I
That would be
actually
time.
think. Oh, okay. That was perfect because I was done. Okay.
Okay.
So my time starts now. As Ben Franklin once said, sometimes winning means stopping your opponent from achieving their goals. So if the objective from achieving their objectives. So if the objective of sanctions is to stop the development of nuclear weapons, then surely economic sanctions are successful. Economic sanctions imposed on Iran not only deterred Iran, but also influenced and stopped other rational countries from developing nuclear weapons. If not for sanctions, we would have been living in a world with the constant threat of a nuclear attack from anywhere at any time. So my opponent suggested the idea that every country had nuclear weapons, and also the concept that if you destroy me, I destroy you, and everybody's destroyed. That is not what we want. Sanctions help promote a nuclear weapon-free world, an ideal world. And also, I talked about rogue nations. Rogue nations are countries that threaten the peace of the world. Nuclear weapons in the hands of rogue nations would be assured destruction for everyone. Plus, the biggest clash in this debate, I think, is standing by versus being humane. We truly cannot live with the guilt later on that we just stood by while all these atrocities took place. Okay. So, Judge, I urge you to vote for Pro for these reasons. We need economic sanctions to keep law and order when important laws are ignored. We need economic sanctions to keep peace in the world. We want to make the world a better place, right? Like I said earlier, nuclear weapons cause mass destruction that can harm many generations to come. Unfortunately, the failures of sanctions are over-exaggerated by people who are not interested in using it and trying to avoid it. So again, Judge, I conclude by urging you to vote for the pro side of this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Abirami. Andrew, your turn. Would you like to use the rest of your prep time?
Yes, please. Thank you.
1 minute starting now. Andrew, that's time, and your 2 minutes may start as soon as you're ready.
Okay, so my time begins now. Once again, my name is Andrew Wu, and today I'm debating for why I disagree with the resolution that economic sanctions do more good than harm. First of all, I'll address something that my opponent stated in her closing speech. She said that economic sanctions have successfully stopped countries from getting nuclear weapons. However, I'll bring up the empirical example of North Korea, which has been sanctioned, but despite sanctions, still has nuclear weapons and nuclear missiles that can strike cities around East Asia. Lastly, I'll just explain why I believe that my arguments carry more weight than my opponents. On my side, we have hundreds of thousands of children dying. We have millions of young girls not being able to access a proper education and not being able to fulfill their life dreams and help out other people because of economic sanctions. On my side, we have leaders getting helped by economic sanctions, which is exactly the opposite of what economic sanctions want to do. On my side, we have leaders continuing to violate the basic human rights of people in their countries to this very day because of the failure of sanctions. On the other hand, on my opponent's side, we have an exaggerated threat of nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are actually not likely to be used. And in addition, as I have shown in my refutation speech, the threat of nuclear weapons may not be that important. It may not be that bad of a thing. In addition, my opponent talks about human rights. However, I bring up how, in my opening speech, I talked about how economic sanctions can actually help leaders hurt human rights. All in all, I believe that my arguments carry much more weight, and that is why I encourage a con ballot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that everyone enjoyed as much as I did. Great job for both of you.